Poitiers, France, 1875. Spring arrived in the city of Poitiers with its mantle of flowers and promises, the narrow streets of the ancient French city filled with life, and in the salons of high society, one name was whispered with admiration and covetousness: Blanche Monnier. At 26, she was considered the most precious jewel of the local aristocracy, a perfect rose cultivated in the most refined garden of the French bourgeoisie. Blanche walked through the corridors of the imposing Monnier mansion with the grace of a ballerina. Her brown hair fell in perfect curls over her shoulders, and her green eyes shone with a lively intelligence that charmed all who had the privilege of speaking with her. She was educated, cultured, versed in literature and music, and fluent in 3 languages. She played the piano masterfully, and her voice, when she sang at family gatherings, had the power to silence even the noisiest guests. The Monnier mansion was a status symbol in Poitiers. Charles-Émile Monnier, the family patriarch, had been dean of the Faculty of Letters, a man of impeccable reputation and respected intellect. His wife, Louise Monnier, was a woman of aristocratic origin, of diluted but not forgotten blue blood, who moved through social circles with the precision of a general commanding troops. She organized the most elegant parties, attended the most important masses, and her opinion on marriages and family alliances was consulted as if she were an oracle. Marcelat, Blanche's eldest son and only brother, was a studious man, a law graduate, who followed in his father's footsteps in the academic world. He was a year older than Blanche and, although reserved and somewhat unsociable, was seen as a well-mannered gentleman with a promising future. He and his sister had a distant, cordial relationship, but without the warm intimacy that some siblings share. Marcel lived in the world of books and law, while Blanche floated in the world of salons and the arts. Suitors were not lacking for Blanche. Young men from wealthy families came from neighboring towns just to glimpse the possibility of winning her heart. Army officers in their gleaming uniforms, heirs to vast estates, promising doctors, all paraded before her like peacocks displaying their plumes. Louise observed each one with calculating eyes, weighing fortunes, titles, and connections like a merchant weighs gold on a scale. For her daughter's marriage was not a matter of love, but of strategy, a crucial move in the social chess game that would determine the future of the Monnier dynasty. But Blanche, despite her refined education and years of being molded into the perfect wife for a wealthy man, harbored a romantic heart. She devoured the books of Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas in secret, dreaming of impossible loves and courageous heroes. On silent nights, when the house slept, she would sit by her bedroom window and gaze at the stars, imagining a different life. A life where she could choose her own destiny. It was in the autumn of 1875 that everything began to change. Blanche was accompanying her mother on a charity visit to the local hospital when her eyes met those of a man who was visiting a patient. He was older, perhaps 40 years old, of average height, with hair beginning to turn gray at the temples. His eyes were deep and kind. And when he smiled at her, Blanche felt something she had never experienced before. An electric current that ran through her body from head to toe. Later, she would discover that the man was Victor Calmet, a Republican lawyer who lived modestly in Poitiers. He had no fortune, no title, no property. He was the son of ordinary merchants and had built his career through hard work and sharp intelligence. He defended unpopular causes, represented the poor and the forgotten, and had a reputation for being a man of unwavering principles, even if it meant refusing wealthy clients whose cases he considered unjust. Fate brought them together again a few weeks later at a lecture on educational reform at the university. Charles Monnier was among the speakers, and Blanche accompanied him, as she always did, listening attentively to the discussions about politics and society. Victor was in the audience, and during a break they met in the university garden. The conversation was brief but intense. Victor spoke of social justice, of the need to educate the masses, of a future where everyone, regardless of birth or fortune, could have equal opportunities. Blanche listened, fascinated not only by the words, but by the passion with which he spoke, by the fire that burned in his eyes when he discussed his ideals. Here was a man who believed in something greater than money and status, a man who dedicated his life to a purpose. When they said goodbye, Blanche knew that something fundamental had changed inside her. That night, she couldn't sleep. Victor's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time in her life, she questioned everything she had been taught about what was important, about what made life worth living. The subsequent encounters were carefully orchestrated by fate and Blanche's growing courage. She began attending public events where she knew Victor would be. Debates, lectures, cultural events open to the community, always accompanied by a lady's companion, of course, but finding ways to exchange a few words with him, to share a smile, a glance that lasted a second longer than was appropriate. Victor, initially hesitant, couldn't resist Blanche's magnetism. She wasn't just beautiful. She was intelligent, curious, and full of life. He saw in her eyes a trapped soul, a butterfly caught in a gilded glass box. And the more they talked, the more he fell in love not only with the woman, but with the person she could be if she were freed from the shackles of her social class. The spring of 1876 arrived like a rebirth. Blanche and Victor found ways to see each other more often. He began sending letters, which she hid in books in the family library. They met briefly at church, at town fairs, always under the watchful but not suspicious gaze of society. To everyone, they were merely casual acquaintances, polite conversations between people who crossed paths in the same broad social circles. But when they were alone, whenever they could find a few precious minutes away from prying eyes, they talked about their dreams. Victor spoke of his humble childhood, of how he had studied by candlelight because his family couldn't afford better lighting, of his determination to make a difference in the world. Blanche shared her secret desires to travel, to see the world beyond the gilded walls of her aristocratic prison, to do something meaningful with her life beyond being just an ornamental wife. It was in May, when the cherry blossoms fell like pink snow on the streets of Poitiers, that Victor mustered the courage to say the words that changed everything. They were in the public garden, sitting on a discreet bench, away from the main paths. He held her hand, feeling his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from his chest. "Blanche," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I know I'm not the kind of man your family would expect for you. I have no fortune, no title. I can't offer you the luxurious life you're accustomed to. But I can offer you something perhaps more valuable, my true love, my complete devotion, and a life of companionship where you would be my equal, not my property." Tears welled up in Blanche's eyes. "Victor," she replied, her voice barely a sigh, "you're offering me exactly what my heart has always desired. I don't want fortunes or titles. I want to live. I want to love. I want to be myself, and I want all of that by your side." They kissed then, there under the cherry trees, a kiss that sealed a tragic fate they couldn't yet imagine. At that moment, everything seemed possible. Love would conquer all. They would find a way. Their family would eventually understand. Love always wins in the end. Isn't that what all the stories say? But reality was not a romantic story, and Louise Monnier was not a character who would bow before young love. The first suspicion arose from a nosy maid who saw Blanche and Victor conversing with suspicious intimacy at the town fair. She rushed to tell Louise, who initially dismissed it as unimportant gossip. But then other observations began to surface, other veiled comments from acquaintances who had noticed that Blanche seemed particularly interested in events where a certain Republican lawyer would be present. Louise began to observe her daughter more closely. She noticed the different sparkle in her eyes, the secret smile that sometimes appeared on her lips when she thought no one was looking, the way she dressed with extra care on certain occasions. A mother knows her daughter, and Louise knew the signs of love. She investigated discreetly. She discovered Victor Calmail, his humble origins, his Republican political views that challenged the established order, his relative poverty, and the more she discovered, the more her anger grew. It wasn't just that he was poor, it was what he represented, a threat to the carefully constructed plan she had for her daughter, for her family, for her social status. Louise summoned Blanche for a private conversation in the mansion's living room. It was a June afternoon, the sun filtering through the velvet curtains, creating golden patterns on the Persian carpet. Blanche entered innocently, perhaps expecting a discussion about some upcoming social event. "Sit down, Blanche," said Louise, her voice as cold as ice. She was seated in her favorite armchair, her hands clasped in her lap, her back straight as an iron rod. There was no emotion on her face, only a stony determination. Blanche felt a shiver of apprehension run down her spine. "Yes, maman? I've been hearing some interesting rumors about you lately," Louise began, observing her daughter's every reaction. "Rumors about a certain unimportant lawyer who seems to be occupying much of your thoughts?" The blood drained from Blanche's face. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult me with lies," Louise cut in, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "You were seen with that man, Victor Calmail, a Republican, a commoner, a man without fortune or future. Do you really think I would allow such a union?" "Maman, I love him," Blanche replied, her voice gaining strength with desperation. "He's a good, honorable, intelligent man." "He's nothing!" Louise exploded, rising from her chair. "He's less than nothing. And you, my daughter, will not throw away your future, our family name, because of a foolish romance with a man who can't even keep you in the style you're used to." "I don't care about style," Blanche shouted back, tears now streaming down her face. "I care about love, about happiness, about living an authentic life." "You know nothing about life," Louise said coldly, regaining her composure. "You were spoiled, protected, raised in luxury. You have no idea what it truly means to suffer, what it truly means to struggle. This love of yours wouldn't survive 6 months in poverty." "Then let me find out for myself," Blanche pleaded. "Please, Mama. I've never asked for anything. I've always been obedient, always done everything you wanted. But this I need. Let me follow my heart." Louise looked at her daughter for a long moment, and something dark passed through her eyes, something Blanche couldn't interpret at that moment, but which she would later recognize as the seed of her destruction. "You will follow my heart," Louise said finally, "or you will follow no heart at all. You will not see that man again. You will not speak to him. You will not write to him. You will not think about him. Is that understood?" "No," Blanche said, her voice firm despite the tears. "I can't promise that. I love him." "So you leave me no choice," Louise replied, and there was something terrible about her calmness. "You are confined to the house until you learn the reason. No outings, no visits, no social events. You will think about your choices and their consequences." And so the nightmare began. At first, Blanche thought it would be temporary, just a brief punishment until her mother cooled down. She wrote letters to Victor in secret, passing them on to loyal maids who promised to deliver them. But these letters never reached their destination. Louise had instructed all the servants, under penalty of immediate dismissal, nothing belonging to Blanche should leave the house, and nothing from outside should reach her. Victor, for his part, was trying to find out what had happened. He went to the Monnier mansion, but was politely but firmly dismissed at the door. He sent letters that were burned before Blanche could see them. He tried to speak to acquaintances of the family, but found only closed doors and awkward silences. Poitiers society knew that the Monniers were a powerful family, and no one wanted to upset Louise. Days turned into weeks. Blanche spent her days wandering around the mansion like a ghost. Her room was her only refuge. She gazed out the window at the world outside, a world that now seemed as distant as a star. She played the piano, but the music came out melancholy and sad. She read, but the words danced meaninglessly before her eyes. Louise watched, hoping her daughter would break down, beg for forgiveness, promise to forget the poor lawyer. But Blanche, despite her frail appearance, had an iron will when it came to matters of the heart. She wouldn't bend, she wouldn't forget. She would wait as long as necessary. It was Charles, the father, who finally tried to intervene. He loved his daughter, and seeing her sadness broke his heart. One night, he went to Blanche's room, sat beside her, and held her hand. "My daughter," he said gently, "your mother is worried about you. We all are. We can't bear to see her like this. suffering because of a reckless decision. "Papa," Blanche replied, looking at her father with pleading eyes, "please understand. Victor is not a bad man. He is good. He is honorable. All I ask is the chance to be happy." Charles sighed heavily. "Happiness, my dear, is more complex than you imagine. Sometimes, what we think will make us happy only brings us pain. Your mother only wants what's best for you." "The best, according to her?" Blanche murmured. "Not according to my heart. The heart is deceitful, Blanche. Reason must always prevail. Then I will never be happy," she replied, and there was such desolation in her voice that Charles felt his own heart break. But he was also a man of his time, conditioned to believe that women needed guidance, that fathers knew what was best. He kissed his daughter on the forehead and left, leaving her more alone than ever. June turned into July. The summer heat enveloped Poitiers like a suffocating cloak. Inside the Monnier mansion, tension grew like a storm brewing on the horizon. Blanche barely ate, visibly losing weight. Her eyes, once bright, became dull and distant, but her resolve did not waver. Louise, realizing that normal measures weren't working, began to consider more drastic options. She consulted Marcel, who agreed that something needed to be done. He consulted the family priest, who suggested prayer and penance. He consulted close friends, who murmured about asylums for rebellious girls, places where disobedient young women were re-educated. But Louise had a different idea, one that germinated slowly and darkly in her mind. If Blanche couldn't be convinced, if she couldn't be forced by normal means, then perhaps she needed to be removed from the equation altogether. Not permanently, of course, just temporarily, just until time and isolation did what arguments and punishments couldn't. It was a sweltering, windless August night when Louise's plan began to take shape. She instructed Marcel to help her prepare a room in the mansion's attic. It was a small room, once used for storage, with a single tall window. They cleared out the old objects, brought in a simple bed and some blankets. They locked the window shutters, nailing them securely. They put a heavy lock on the door. "Mom," Marcel hesitated, seeing the starkness of the room. "Are you sure about this? It seems extreme." "It's necessary," Louise replied, her voice undeniable. "Your sister needs to learn that there are consequences for disobedience. A few days here, in quiet contemplation, will do her good. She'll thank you later." Marcel, always obedient to his mother, always fearing her disapproval, agreed. He convinced himself that it was for Blanche's own good, that it was a temporary measure, that she would soon see the reason, and everything would return to normal. That night, Louise went to Blanche's room. "Come with me," she ordered. It wasn't a request. "Where to?" Blanche asked, confused but not yet alarmed. "To a place where you can think clearly, without distractions." Blanche followed her mother up the narrow stairs that led to the attic. When they entered the small, dark room, a wave of dread washed over her. "Maman, what is this?" "Your new room," Louise replied calmly, "until you learn to obey." "No?" Blanche recoiled, but Marcel was behind her, blocking her escape. "Please, don't do this. I promise, I will." "What will you do?" Louise challenged. "Promise to forget your poor lover. Promise to accept a proper marriage. Then promise. Promise now, and it won't be necessary." Blanche looked at her mother, at her brother, and saw the determination in their faces. And at that moment, she could have lied. She could have made the false promise, bought her freedom with empty words, but something in her, some core of honesty and stubbornness, wouldn't allow it. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the terror she felt. "I won't promise a lie. I love Victor, and nothing you do will change that." "So be it," Louise said, and pushed Blanche into the room. The door closed with a final sound, the key turning in the lock. Louise and Marcel's footsteps descending the stairs echoed like distant thunder. And then, silence. Blanche ran to the door, banging on it with her fists. "Maman, Marcel, please, let me out!" She screamed until her voice was hoarse, until her hands ached. But no one came. The mansion absorbed her screams as if they were nothing. Eventually, exhausted, she slid to the floor, hugging her knees. The darkness was almost complete. Only a thin sliver of light filtered through the boards nailed to the window. The air was stifling, smelling of old wood and mold. This couldn't be real. It was a nightmare. Soon she would wake up. But she didn't wake up. When dawn arrived, she was still there, huddled on the hard floor, trembling not from cold, but from a growing understanding of the gravity of her situation. Hours later, the door opened briefly. A maid, with downcast eyes and trembling hands, entered with a tray, bread, water, an apple. "Please," Blanche pleaded, "tell my father. Tell him where I am." "He doesn't know. He wouldn't allow it." But the maid merely shook her head sadly and left, closing the door again. Blanche understood then. Everyone knew, and no one would help. Charles Monnier knew. Yes, Louise had told him that Blanche was being rebellious and that a period of seclusion would be beneficial. He initially protested, but Louise was relentless. "It's for her own good," she insisted. "You're being weak. She needs firmness. She needs to understand that there are limits." Charles, tired and increasingly ill with his own professional worries, gave in. He convinced himself that Louise knew what she was doing, that it was only temporary, that Blanche would soon see the reason. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. What Louise had planned as a few days of reflection stretched indefinitely. Every time she thought about freeing Blanche, the old anger returned. Every time she heard news of Victor Calmel, still active in the city, still searching for his daughter, her resolve grew stronger. To the outside world, the Monnier family had a prepared story. Blanche had suffered a nervous breakdown and was recovering in the countryside, in a quiet place, far from social pressures. Some acquaintances believed her, others suspected something darker, but no one questioned her openly. The Monnier family was too powerful, too respected, desperate. Victor Calmel tried everything. He questioned the authorities, but without proof of a crime, no one would intervene. He tried to hire investigators, but his money was limited. He spent months, then years, searching for Blanche, visiting mental institutions, hospitals, convents, anywhere she might have been taken. But he never thought to look in the most obvious place, the very house where she had disappeared. Up there, in the small attic room, Blanche underwent a slow and agonizing transformation. In the first few months, she maintained her sanity and hope through the memory of Victor, through dreams of rescue. She spoke to him in her mind, told him about her days, promised that she would wait, that she would be faithful, that her love would survive. Meals came twice a day, shoved through a small opening in the door, stale bread, water, sometimes a thin soup, just enough to keep her alive. Never enough to satisfy. Her body began to wither. Her muscles atrophied. There was no mirror, but she could feel her bones becoming more prominent, her skin stretching over them. Time had lost its meaning. Without a calendar, without a clock, without the normal variation of days and activities, everything merged into a gray and endless fog. She tried to keep track of the days by scratching the wall with her fingernails, but eventually lost count. Was it summer? Winter? How much time had passed? Weeks, months. Loneliness was the worst torture. Humans weren't made for complete solitude. Our minds need interaction, stimulation, connection. Without it, we begin to fall apart. Blanche started talking to herself. Then she started responding. She created imaginary characters, having elaborate conversations with versions of her memories of Victor, her father, even her mother. Hygiene became impossible. She received a basin of dirty water once a week to wash herself. But there was no toilet, only a bucket that was emptied irregularly. The smell became unbearable, then familiar, then part of her existence. She stopped noticing it. Her clothes gradually wore out, tearing and rotting with sweat and dirt. Eventually, she was left with rags that barely covered her emaciated body. The food that fell to the ground, which she sometimes couldn't eat all of, began to attract insects. Rats appeared in the darkness, their small eyes gleaming, stealing crumbs. She tried to shoo them away at first, then learned to live with them. They were, at least, living beings, company in a distorted way. The years passed like a slow, inexorable avalanche. 1877 came and went, marked only by an illness that nearly killed her, a fever that left her delirious for days until she finally broke, leaving her weaker than ever. 1878, 1879, 1880, the years piled up like dust. Charles Monnier died in 1879, never having freed his daughter. In his last days, delirious with fever, he murmured her name. But Louise was always there, always vigilant, always certain she was doing the right thing. Marcel, now the man of the house, had the power to free Blanche, but the habit of obedience to his mother was too deeply ingrained. And part of him, the part that wanted peace, that wanted maternal approval, chose not to see, not to question. Victor Calmel continued searching for years. He never married, never stopped hoping. But in 1885, 9 years after he last saw Blanche, he died suddenly of a fever. His last words were her name. He was buried in a modest grave, and only a few friends attended the funeral. Among his belongings, they found a bundle of unsent letters, all addressed to my dearest Blanche. Up there, Blanche didn't know of his death. She still hoped, still clung to his memory like a life preserver in an ocean of darkness. But something inside her began to break in a fundamental way. The human mind has limits, and she was exceeding them all. She developed strange rituals to maintain her sanity. She would count to 1,000, then start again. She would recite poems she had memorized years ago, although the words would begin to jumble and mix. Sometimes she would dance, moving around the small space in steps she remembered from dances she had attended in another life. But her movements were clumsy, her body no longer responding as it once did. The hallucinations began around the age of 10. She saw things in the darkness, shapes that moved, faces that appeared and disappeared. She heard music that didn't exist, voices calling to her. Sometimes, Victor would appear to her, so real that she could swear she could touch him. They would talk, laugh, dance together. When she realized it was just her mind playing cruel tricks, the despair that followed was almost unbearable. Her hair, never cut, grew to her ankles, a wild tangle full of dirt and insects. Her nails, never trimmed, curved into grotesque spirals. Her skin, never exposed to the sun, became pale as paper, almost translucent. She became less human each day, more creature than woman. Louise continued her normal life. She attended mass, organized teas, and donated to charities. She was seen as a pillar of the community, a respectable and devout widow. At night, when she lay in her comfortable bed, she sometimes heard sounds from the attic, muffled sounds that could be crying or just the wind. She ignored them. She had become completely convinced that she was doing the right thing, that she was protecting the family name, that Blanche would one day be grateful. Marcel lived in an adjacent house but visited daily. He knew where his sister was. Obviously he knew, but he had built elaborate mental walls to justify the situation. She was ill. She was being cared for in the only way possible. She was dangerous to herself and others. It was for her own good. He never went upstairs to see the conditions in which she lived. He didn't want to know. Knowledge would bring responsibility, and responsibility would bring the need for action. The 1890s arrived. The Belle Époque was in full bloom in Paris and other major cities. Technology was advancing. The world was changing. But in a small room in Poitiers, time had stood still in 1876. Blanche had forgotten how to speak properly. Her voice, when she occasionally tried to use it, came out in inarticulate growls and moans. She had forgotten the names of things, the structures of language. Her mind, deprived of stimulation, had begun to cannibalize itself, destroying memories and skills that were no longer necessary for mere survival. Most days she no longer knew who she was. Blanche Monnier, the beautiful socialite, was dead. In her place was something more primitive, a creature of instinct and fear. She ate when food appeared. She slept when exhausted. She existed, but could hardly be called alive. 20 years passed. Then 21, 22, 23. Louise grew old. Her hair turned completely white. Her hands developed arthritis. But her determination never wavered. Blanche would remain where she was. It was that simple. But then, in the spring of 1901, something extraordinary happened. Someone, somewhere in Poitiers, knew. Someone had discovered the Monnier family's terrible secret. Perhaps it was a maid with a guilty conscience. Perhaps it was a family friend who had noticed too much. Perhaps it was someone who had heard strange sounds coming from the attic. No one would ever know. This anonymous person, this nameless hero, sat down and wrote a letter to the Attorney General of Paris. The letter was simple, direct, horribly brevity-ridden. Mr. Attorney General, I have the honor to inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I refer to a single woman who has been locked in Mrs. Monnier's house, half-starved and living in a putrid bed for the last 25 years. In short, in her own filth. The letter reached its destination on May 23, 1901. The shocked but skeptical Attorney General ordered an immediate investigation. He dispatched an order to the police commissioner of Poitiers, instructing him to inspect the Monnier residence without delay. On the afternoon of Thursday, May 23, 1901, at around 5 o'clock, Commissioner Bucheton of the Poitiers police arrived at the Monnier mansion. He was accompanied by several officers and armed with the prosecutor's order. When he knocked on the door, a maid answered, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to speak with Mrs. Monnier," Bucheton said firmly, "that we have orders to inspect the property." The maid, trembling, consulted Louise, who was in her room, supposedly bedridden due to her advanced age. At 75, Louise was a physically frail woman, but her mind was still sharp. When informed of the police presence, she knew immediately why they were there, but she had kept her secret for 25 years. She wouldn't give it up easily now. She instructed the maid to call Marcel, who lived on the neighboring property. While the police waited, Bucheton noticed the impeccable state of the house. Everything was clean, organized, respectable. It didn't seem like a place where a terrible crime was taking place. Marcel arrived, perplexed but maintaining his composure. "How can I help you, gentlemen? We have information that a woman is being held against her will on this property," Bucheton explained, "and we need to inspect all the premises." "That's absurd," Marcel replied, but there was sweat on his brow. "My mother and I live here. No one is being held against their will." "Then you won't mind if we look for it?" Bucheton said. It wasn't a question. Marcel had no choice. He guided them through the house, opening doors, showing them rooms. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The police began to think that perhaps it was a bad joke, a false accusation. But then one of the officers noticed a locked door at the end of a corridor leading to the attic. "And there?" he asked. "Just storage," Marcel said quickly. "Old family things." "Open," Bucheton ordered. Marcel hesitated, his hand trembling as he searched for the key. At that moment, he could have confessed. He could have prepared the police for what they would find. But pride, shame, and fear kept him silent. He unlocked the door. The smell hit them first. A physical wall of stench so intense that several officers recoiled, covering their noses and mouths. It was the smell of decomposition, of accumulated human excrement, of rotting flesh, of despair and death condensed into an olfactory assault. "My God," one of the officers murmured, his eyes welling with tears. They climbed the narrow stairs, the smell intensifying with each step. There was another door at the top, also locked. Marcel, now visibly trembling, opened it. The darkness inside was almost complete. Bucheton lit a flashlight, and the light revealed a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In a corner of the small room, on a bed made of rotten wood and soaked straw, lay what initially appeared to be an animal. But then, when the light struck it, the creature stirred, flinching from the sudden, painful brightness. It made a sound, a sharp cry of terror and confusion, covering its face with skeletal hands. "Jesus Christ," Bucheton whispered, the lantern trembling in his hand. She was a woman, or had once been, but she barely looked human. She was completely naked, her skin stretched over prominent bones, covered by a layer of filth so thick that her natural color was impossible to determine. Her hair, a wild and dirty tangle that extended to her ankles, was infested with insects that visibly scurried through the strands. Her nails had grown into grotesque spirals, some breaking and curling back upon themselves. Around her, the ground was covered with layers of human excrement, rotten food remains, and a crust of filth so old it had solidified. There were rat bones, snail shells, pieces of moldy green bread, insects, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, scurried all over everything, including the woman's body. She didn't even seem to notice them anymore. The bed itself was no longer a bed, but a putrid collection of rotten straw, decaying wood, and other filth. The woman lay on it as if it were the only place in her world, which it truly was. "Who is she?" Buckerton asked, his voice hoarse, barely able to form the words. Marcel, tears now streaming down his face, murmured, "My sister, Blanche Monnier." The officers were in silent shock. This creature, this fragment of shattered humanity, had once been Blanche Monnier, the beautiful socialite who had disappeared 25 years ago. They approached her slowly, carefully, as if she might break at the slightest touch, which she probably could. Blanche recoiled as far as she could, pressing herself against the wall, her eyes, so accustomed to the darkness, burning painfully in the light. She made sounds, but no words, growls and moans of a wild creature. "We need to get her out of here," an officer said. Immediately, they tried to wrap her in a blanket, but she fought with surprising strength for someone so emaciated. It took 4 men to gently restrain her, to lift her from the nest of filth that had been her world for a quarter of a century. As they carried her out of the room, she began to scream, a sound none of the men present would ever forget. These weren't screams of words, but primal cries of utter terror. The outside world, after 25 years in darkness, was such an intense sensory overload that her fragmented mind couldn't process it. The sunlight, when it finally reached her as they were led out of the house, caused her physical pain. She tried to cover her eyes, groaning in agony. Her skin, never exposed to the sun for so long, was so pale it almost seemed translucent, the blue veins visible beneath the surface. A doctor was called immediately. When he arrived and examined Blanche, he was shocked. She weighed only 25 kilos, less than a child. Her muscles had atrophied to the point where she could barely move on her own. Her bones were fragile, probably with advanced osteoporosis due to lack of sun and nutrition. Her internal organs were in critical condition. But worse than the physical damage was the mental damage. Blanche didn't recognize anyone. She didn't answer questions. She didn't seem to understand language. Her eyes had a vacant, distant look, as if she were staring at something far beyond the material world. She was, for all practical purposes, mentally destroyed. Louise Monnier and Marcel were arrested immediately. A crowd began to gather outside the Monnier mansion as soon as the news spread. The city of Poitiers, so proud of its respectable aristocratic family, was in shock and horror. How could this have happened? How did no one know? How could they all fail so completely to protect one of their own? The crowd became enraged. They shouted insults, threw stones at the mansion's windows. They wanted justice. They wanted revenge. The police had to form a barricade to protect Louise and Marcel while they were taken to prison. Louise, confronted with her imprisonment, showed no remorse. She simply said she had done what needed to be done to protect her family. Blanche had been stubborn, rebellious. She needed to learn a lesson that lasted 25 years? Well, it had been a hard lesson to learn. But the stress of the scandal, the anger of the crowd, the reality finally catching up with her madness, was too much for Louise's frail body. 15 days after Blanche's discovery, still in prison, Louise Monnier died of a heart attack. She was 75 years old and took her secrets, her real motives, her justifications, to the grave. Marcel went to trial. His case created a fascinating and horrific legal precedent. Prosecutors argued that he was an accomplice to kidnapping and abuse. The defense argued that he had been dominated by his mother, that he had been conditioned since childhood to obey, that he himself was a victim in a way. The jury initially convicted him, but on appeal, the decision was overturned. The court found that, although his actions or inactions were morally reprehensible, There was no specific duty to rescue law at the time that would make him criminally liable. He had not physically restrained Blanche, nor had he directly caused her suffering. He simply had done nothing. He was acquitted, but his life was ruined. He became an outcast in Poitiers, spat upon in the street, shunned even by long-time acquaintances. He lived in virtual seclusion until his death in June 1913, at the age of 65. Rumors said that he drank heavily, that he spent his days in silent penance, that he never smiled again after the trial. As for Blanche, she was immediately hospitalized. The doctors worked tirelessly to restore her physical health. Carefully fed, she began to gain weight. Her hair was cut, her body meticulously washed, her nails were trimmed. The wounds and infections on her skin were treated. Physically, she improved. Within a few weeks, she had gained several pounds. Within a few months, she could walk again with assistance. Her surprisingly resilient body began to heal, but her mind was another story. The psychiatrists who examined her diagnosed multiple conditions: schizophrenia, anorexia nervosa, exhibitionism, coprophilia. But these diagnoses were limited by the psychiatric understanding of the time. What Blanche truly suffered from was extreme PTSD, prolonged sensory deprivation, isolation trauma, and brain damage caused by years of malnutrition and lack of mental stimulation. She never regained her sanity. She would spend hours staring into nothingness. Sometimes she spoke, but her words were disjointed, fragments of memories from a life she could no longer piece together. Occasionally, she mentioned Victor, but it wasn't clear if she remembered him as a real person or as a character from some distant dream. It was decided that she could not live independently. She was transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Blois, where she would spend the last years of her life. The doctors and nurses there were kind, doing their best to make her comfortable. She had a room with a window, proper food, clean clothes, all the things that had been denied her for so long. But Blanche was never happy, never found peace. How could she? 25 years of her life had been stolen. Her youth, her beauty, her sanity, her love, all destroyed by the cruelty and pride of her own mother. She was an empty shell of what she could have been. The case caused a sensation in France. Newspapers published detailed articles, drawings of the room where she was kept, and speculations about her condition. There were public debates about women's rights, about parental authority, about when the family had gone too far. But after a few months, as usually happens, public attention shifted to other scandals, other tragedies. Blanche Monnier was forgotten by everyone, except for a few. In the autumn of 1913, Blanche Monnier died in the psychiatric hospital. She was 64 years old, but looked 80. Her body, so abused for so long, simply gave up. There was no grand funeral, no weeping crowds. She was buried quietly, almost in secret, in a distant corner of a cemetery in Blois. Her gravestone was simple, just her name and dates. It didn't mention the horror she had endured. It didn't tell her story. She departed this world as silently as she had been forced to live for a quarter of a century. A few months later, in June 1913, Marcel Monnier also died, whether it was from illness, accident, or perhaps by his own hand. The records don't clearly state. He was buried in the family cemetery in Poitiers. Though far from his mother's grave, even in death, some ties were too strong to break completely. The Monnier mansion, once a symbol of prestige and respect, was eventually sold. The family had been destroyed. The Monnier name forever tarnished. No one wanted to live in a house where such horror had occurred. For years, it remained empty, slowly deteriorating, until it was finally demolished at the beginning of the 20th century. The small attic room where Blanche spent 25 years was destroyed along with the rest. The wood was burned, the stones scattered. It was as if everyone wanted to erase any physical evidence that such an atrocity had occurred. But it's impossible to erase memory, not completely. Victor Calmel, Blanche's lover, never knew she had been found. He had died 16 years earlier, still searching for her, still loving her, still faithful. His unsent letters were found after his death, but never reached Blanche. Perhaps it was for the best. Perhaps the knowledge that he had waited, had searched, had died without knowing the truth would have been too much additional pain for his fragmented mind to bear. In 1930, the writer André Gide published a book about the case, titled La Séquestrée de Poitiers, The Confined Woman of Poitiers. He changed the names, but the story was unequivocally that of Blanche. The book brought the case back to public awareness briefly. But even then, it was more morbid curiosity than genuine compassion or understanding. Today, more than a century later, the case of Blanche Monnier remains one of the most shocking examples of family cruelty in history. It is used in psychology textbooks to illustrate the extreme effects of prolonged isolation. It is discussed in law courses on duty of care and family responsibility. It is told as a horror story, which it truly was. But behind the statistics, the medical diagnoses, the legal proceedings, there was a real person. Blanche Monnier was a real young woman who had the audacity to love someone she shouldn't have. According to her mother, she had the courage to defy expectations, to choose her own path, to insist on her right to happiness. And for that audacity, for that courage, she paid the most horrific price imaginable. She wasn't killed quickly, which perhaps would have been more merciful. Instead, she was killed slowly, gradually, over 25 years. Her youth, her sanity, her humanity. Everything was taken from her piece by piece, day after day, year after year. The true tragedy of Blanche Monnier's case is not only what happened to her, but what it reveals about humanity's capacity for cruelty. Louise Monnier was not a monster in the traditional sense. She was a respectable, devout woman who went to church, donated to charities, and was loved by her community. Yet, she was capable of inflicting such suffering on her own daughter and sleeping peacefully at night, convinced that she was doing the right thing. And perhaps that's the most terrifying lesson of all, that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like worried mothers, respectable families, pillars of the community. Sometimes the worst horrors happen not in dark alleys or haunted forests, but inside seemingly normal homes, behind locked doors, in silent attics. Blanche Monnier's story is a reminder that we must always be vigilant, always questioning, always ready to intervene when we see signs of abuse or neglect. How many are still out there, locked in rooms, in impossible situations, waiting for someone, anyone, to send an anonymous letter, to make a phone call, to break the silence? The person who sent that letter to the Attorney General in May 1901 saved Blanche, albeit too late to truly save her, but they tried. When everyone else looked the other way, when the entire city of Poitiers chose not to see, not to hear, not to know, one person chose to act. This person, whose name remains unknown to this day, is the true hero of this horrific story. Not the police officers who found Blanche, not the doctors who tried to cure her, not the journalists who exposed the case, but the anonymous person who decided that silence was no longer acceptable, that the secret needed to be revealed, that a life, even a life as shattered as Blanche's, was still worth saving. And so the story ends not with a happy fairy tale ending, but with the brutal reality of the human condition. Blanche Monnier lived, suffered beyond imagination, and died. But she is not forgotten. Her story continues, told and retold, a warning and a memorial, a cry from a past where women were property, where love was a sin, where cruelty could disguise itself as virtue. May her story never be forgotten. May it always serve as a reminder that we have a duty to protect the vulnerable, to speak for the silenced, to act when we witness injustice. May Blanche Monnier's name be remembered not only for the tragedy she suffered, but for the lesson she left us. That love is worth fighting for, that freedom is worth defending, and that no tradition, no family pride, no social convention is worth a human life. The kidnapped woman of Poitiers, the confined woman of Poitiers, Blanche Monnier, a woman who dared to love, a daughter who became a prisoner, a soul that was destroyed, a story that must never be forgotten,